August 23rd, 1305 London. A man is about to die in the most horrific way medieval England could devise, but this isn't just any execution, this is the death that would accidentally birth a nation. What King Edward thought would end Scottish resistance forever became the spark that ignited it. This is the story of William Wallace's final day and why his gruesome death became an epic fail to silence a nation. But first, who was William Wallace? Wittan Wallate was born to Wallace. William Wallace wasn't born to be a legend. He was a minor nobleman's son from Renfrew, educated but completely unremarkable, just another face in medieval Scotland until King Edward Longshanks invaded in 1296 and ruined everyone's day. Now you might be wondering how we got to this point. Well, a rusted manacle, a floor slick with urine, the stench of mildew, human waste, and infected flesh so thick it clung to the back of the throat. The sounds were worse. Chains scraping across stone, rats skittering through the straw, and sometimes screams. Long, inhuman howls that began with words and ended with the terrible sobbing of men who no longer remembered their names. This was the smell, the sound, and the sight that greeted William Wallace as he was dragged into the bowels of the Tower of London in August 1305. The man once feared as the guardian of Scotland was now a filthy prisoner in a place where death came not as an execution but as a slow fermentation. Once they had him, the English didn't kill him quickly. They let him rot first. He was shackled in chains, each wrist weighed down by iron cuffs, each ankle scabbed by cold metal. There were no beds in the dungeon, only straw matted with blood and feces. And he had to lie on his side. Wallace's back had already been lashed raw by his captors. His face bore the purple swelling of recent blows. And still, he breathed. Captured near Glasgow by Scottish nobles loyal to King Edward, Wallace was betrayed not by force, but by politics. Sir John Menteith of Dumbarton, an opportunist in a time of chaos, delivered Wallace to the English in exchange for royal favor. The reward was silence, the cost was national shame. Wallace was brought to London in chains. But not discreetly. He was paraded like a war trophy. Crowds lined the roads. They jeered, spat, and pelted him with refuse. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see the wild Scot who had once burned English towns to the ground. His beard was tangled. His skin sun-darkened and split. But he still had the eyes of a man who refused to bow. And that was the problem. Edward I, Longshanks, was dying. His bones ached with every movement, and rumors of chronic digestive rot followed him from court to chamber. Some claimed his breath could sour milk. But his hatred for Wallace had not dimmed with age. It burned hotter, like the belly ulcers that plagued him. To Edward, Wallace was not a man. He was an idea, a ragged phantom that haunted the throne with the memory of rebellion. Killing him was not enough. He had to be broken. The dungeon was the first act. It was here that Wallace's body began to decay before the executioner's rope ever touched his throat. His diet was meager, black bread hard as wood, spoiled meat that dripped with fat, and water drawn from the Thames, teeming with disease. He slept, when he could, pressed against stone walls slick with moss and the residue of centuries of prisoners. Historians still argue whether Wallace was tortured during his confinement. Some believe the bruises seen at his trial came from beatings, others think they were self-inflicted during seizures or fever. One scholar noted records of sudden episodes of madness, likely caused by either starvation or the consumption of moldy food, a common issue in English prisons of the 14th century. The bread often contained ergot, a fungus with effects similar to LSD. If Wallace screamed at night, it might not have been fear, but hallucinations. But still, he survived. And every morning the guards looked at him with a mix of irritation and awe. He would not die on his own. One guard noted in a marginalia of the Tower's daybook that Wallace spoke little, except to curse. He refused confession. Refused to beg. And when a priest came to urge him toward repentance, Wallace allegedly asked, "Repent for what? For not kneeling to thieves?" By August 22nd, the order had come down. Wallace would be tried for treason. But even this was theater. The trial was not to determine guilt, only to affirm it. There would be no defense. No cross-examination. No jury of peers. In the gilded hall of Westminster, under the cold gaze of English lords and commoners alike, Wallace was brought forth in shackles. His hair had been crudely cut. His lips were cracked and bleeding. But when they accused him of betraying the king, he answered clearly, "I never swore allegiance to Edward." It didn't matter. The court found him guilty in minutes. The sentence was already written. He would be hanged until near death. Then cut down, his abdomen sliced open, his intestines pulled out while he still breathed. His genitals would be hacked off and burned before his eyes. Finally, he would be decapitated and quartered, his limbs sent to the corners of the kingdom as warnings. But first, he would wait. 3 more nights in the dungeon. 3 nights listening to the screams of the condemned, the whisper of rats through straw, the drip of water on stone. And always, the rising smell of something dead that hadn't been cleared out yet. In the corner of his cell was a pile of hay, crawling with lice. It was there he lay, one eye crusted shut, one hand twitching from nerve damage. A physician, likely a monk, was sent to examine him. Not to treat him. Just to make sure he would last long enough to suffer. He would. At dawn, the cell door groaned open. Sunlight pierced the darkness. Wallace blinked, raised his head. The day had come. The cart was nothing more than a flat wooden plank with wheels, lined with damp straw and splintered at the edges. Wallace's body was tied down with rope, coarse, oil-stained, and frayed from repeated use. His arms were pulled above his head, his legs splayed out like an animal brought to slaughter. A chain was wrapped around his neck and fastened to the rear of a horse. And so he was dragged. Through the streets of London, from the Tower to Smithfield, they pulled him like cargo. He did not walk, nor was he carried. This was not mercy. This was humiliation. Crowds gathered again, thicker this time, pressing so close that guards had to beat them back with the flats of their swords. Children scrambled onto rooftops. Women jeered from balconies. And at every corner, someone shouted, "Traitor!" The word rang out like a bell toll, again and again, until even the sky seemed to echo it. But Wallace, chained and bleeding, said nothing. His face bounced against the wood with every cobblestone. Blood mixed with the filth of the street. Bits of brick, dung, and rotten fruit stuck to the gashes in his cheeks. His joints cracked from the strain of being pulled over uneven ground. Occasionally, his body would rise slightly, lifted by a jolt in the road, before slamming back down with a sickening thud. It is believed he lost consciousness at least once, but he was revived with water. Not clean water. Bucket water, scooped from the roadside, brown and brackish. This wasn't transport. It was the first act of the execution. The English crown had no intention of simply killing William Wallace. He was to be deconstructed, piece by piece, in front of an audience. Not just to punish him, but to send a message to anyone who might dream of defiance. Smithfield was already prepared. The market square, usually alive with butchers, peddlers, and livestock, had been cleared. A platform had been built. High, so no one would miss a thing. There were poles, hooks, tables, and barrels of lime and pitch. A fire had been lit. Not for warmth. For burning. This was not justice. It was blood sport. Edward I, too ill to attend, had sent his representatives. There were nobles in fine clothes, priests in black robes, and soldiers in polished armor. But there were also peasants, shopkeepers, children, drunkards, and thieves. London had turned out for a show. And they got one. Wallace was untied and lifted, barely able to stand. His clothes, soaked in urine and blood, were cut from his body. Naked and smeared in street filth, he was shoved against the central post. There was no blindfold. No prayer. Just the executioner, in a soot-stained leather apron, nodding once before stepping away. The rope was thrown over the beam. They hanged him, not to kill, but to strangle. Slowly. He dangled there, twitching, legs kicking out in wide, helpless arcs. The crowd grew quiet. You could hear the creak of the rope, the scrape of his toenails against the wood as he tried, pointlessly, to find purchase. His face turned red, then purple. His tongue lolled out. And just when unconsciousness seemed inevitable, they cut him down. He fell with a dull thud, coughing up thick, foamy strings of blood. The worst was yet to come. He was strapped to a table. Spread eagle. His wrists and ankles bound so tightly that flesh bulged around the leather. A man approached with a long knife, not sharp like a dagger, but curved, like something meant for gutting livestock. And then they opened him. From sternum to pelvis. His skin split like parchment soaked in oil. Blood poured out in bursts, then in sickening rhythm with his heartbeat. A bucket was placed beneath the table to catch it. He screamed. Loud, hoarse, primal. But the crowd had come for this. They leaned forward, some shielding their children's eyes too late. His intestines were pulled out slowly. Coiled like rope. Still warm. Still twitching. There is debate among scholars, was he conscious throughout? Some say yes. Others believe he faded in and out, his mind shattered by pain. A recent theory suggests opiate-like shock may have dulled the pain briefly, but the presence of records describing agonized cries and the man's final shriek implies otherwise. Then came the most grotesque moment. His genitals were severed. Castration was both symbolic and cruel. The executioner held them up, walked the platform like a grotesque herald, then tossed them into the fire. The scent of burning flesh drifted over the square. A dry, greasy smoke that made some onlookers retch. Wallace was still alive. There were more screams. Then a silence so total it felt staged. Next, the heart. There are accounts, disputed but persistent, that Wallace's heart was removed while he still breathed. Some say it was the final act. Others suggest it marked the moment of death. Either way, it was torn from his chest and thrown into the flames. What remained was a ruin. His body was unrecognizable. A bloody sack of bones and butchered meat. But the performance wasn't over. The decapitation came after. His head was removed with a small axe. Not in one blow. It took several, each one splitting more than cutting. The skull was eventually crushed more than severed. A single, final strike snapped the vertebrae and the head fell, thudding wetly onto a cloth-covered board. The crowd was silent again. Not out of respect, but awe. William Wallace, the man, was gone. Now came the making of a message. His corpse was quartered, cut at the joints, hacked into 4 uneven limbs. These would be cleaned, boiled in brine and pitch, and then sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. Gateposts would bear his remains for years. The message was clear: this is what happens to rebels. His head, tarred to prevent decay, was mounted on a pike above London Bridge. Crows took the eyes within days. Some said the head grinned. Others swore the lips moved in the wind. A few even crossed themselves and whispered that his ghost wandered the bridge at night, silent and unbowed. This was execution as theater, as ritual, as propaganda. And it worked. At least for a while. The sky was gray when they dragged the cart through London again, this time carrying only limbs, tightly bound in blood-soaked cloth. They tied the fragments down with fresh rope, already stiffening from dried brine, and set off for the 4 corners of the kingdom. Newcastle. Berwick. Stirling. Perth. Each a site of Wallace's past defiance. Each chosen not at random, but with surgical cruelty. But the real spectacle had already taken place. What happened at Smithfield was something few could forget, even among execution-hardened Londoners. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was England's most infamous punishment. Officially reserved for traitors, unofficially reserved for legends. And in Wallace, they had both. Yet even by medieval standards, this was something darker. The aftermath lingered like smoke. People who had watched the execution retold it for days. Some bragged about how close they stood to the platform. Others claimed they could smell the entrails from 50 yards away. Rumors swirled that part of his intestines had twitched on the ground after they were dropped. One fishmonger near the Thames swore she saw the executioner lick blood from his knife. There are few reliable records of the man who wielded the blade that day. Executioners were rarely named, men of violence and necessity, not honor. But in this case, the man was likely a professional brought in from the southern provinces, someone with experience in flaying, eviscerating, and the subtle art of keeping a man alive long enough to regret it. And that rope Wallace was hanged with? It may have been reused. Some prisons in Edwardian England kept a special loop of execution rope for high-profile traitors. Not out of ceremony, but because hemp was expensive, and boiling blood made it easier to remove stains for the next victim. The fire used to burn Wallace's heart and genitals burned for hours after his death. They threw in bits of cloth, wood, and even waste, part practical, part ritualistic. Fire was the final insult, believed to purify the soul if used properly. But in this case, it served to erase. Erasure was Edward's goal. Wallace's death was not just meant to end a man. It was meant to obliterate a symbol. The English crown wanted no shrine, no tomb, no body to rally around. Only scattered pieces, rotting quietly in distant towns. The body parts were treated with lime and pitch before transport. This was not out of respect, but to prevent the smell from turning the cart into a mobile charnel house. Still, there are accounts of townsfolk refusing to touch the cart when it arrived, even with gloves and incense. One monk in Stirling claimed that the limb sent there, likely an arm, began to weep yellow fluid from the joint within days. Whether this was due to decomposition or superstition remains unclear. Some of Wallace's remains were nailed to church doors. Others were hung on the gates where merchants entered the cities. One was supposedly displayed above a tavern, though most scholars dispute this as the invention of later Jacobite storytellers. What we do know is this: no single grave exists. No cairn. No holy site. He was denied a burial. This wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare. In Scotland, news of his death spread slowly and with distortions. Some believed he had died in battle. Others heard whispers of poison or secret captivity. But once the truth emerged, limb by limb, it sowed both rage and silence. Scottish chroniclers, writing decades later, struggled with how to describe it. They lacked the words for a punishment so English, so meticulously cruel. They called it the butcher's death or the traitor's end, yet it fit neither Wallace's legend nor their native customs. In Gaelic culture, death was communal, sacred, sometimes even poetic. What Wallace endured was industrial, public, designed to scrape the soul clean from the flesh. Modern historians often point to Wallace's execution as one of the most grotesque state killings in medieval Britain. The mix of torture, dismemberment, and transportation of body parts was not unprecedented, but rarely applied with such public enthusiasm. One lesser-known record, found in the personal diary of an English scribe, notes the strange silence in Westminster in the days following Wallace's death. According to the entry, a nobleman allegedly remarked, "The fire cleansed the traitor, yet the smell remains." The smell. It's mentioned again and again. Even today, forensic anthropologists debate whether Wallace would have remained conscious during the gutting. Some say the removal of the intestines would have caused immediate shock and unconsciousness. Others, relying on comparative executions of the period, suggest a person could remain aware for several minutes if the blade was slow and careful. It was slow and careful. And then, of course, came the head. Mounted above London Bridge, tarred to resist rot, it became more than a relic. It became a warning. Travelers crossing into the city from the south would pass under the severed head of William Wallace, his hair blackened with smoke, his features bloated and dried by the sun, his jaw slightly unhinged. One traveler described it as grinning against the wind. Another, a Flemish merchant, recorded in a letter, "The Scotsman's head greets us at the gate. It stares without seeing." I walked faster. Heads did not stay long. Birds claimed them. The wind unwrapped them. Eventually, the skull would fall or be removed to make way for the next rebel. Wallace's was replaced by the head of a Welsh prince 3 years later. By then, no one remembered the exact date he died. Only how. And perhaps that was the point. But memory is stubborn. Even when erased from the body, even when broken into pieces and scattered to the winds, William Wallace refused to vanish. He lived on, first in whispers, then in ballads, then in something stronger, legend. And yet, that legend did not emerge overnight. In the months following his execution, Scotland fell quiet. Leaders went into hiding. Some surrendered. Others simply vanished into the forests and hills. The brutal precision of Wallace's death had struck its intended note, terror. It hummed through villages like a plague bell. There are accounts of Scots refusing to speak his name aloud. But silence is not the same as forgetting. In fact, silence tends to ferment memory, ripening it, distorting it, giving it potency. And while Edward I may have succeeded in obliterating Wallace's body, he only deepened the shadow of the myth. Smithfield became the ground zero of that myth. Travelers would sometimes visit the square where Wallace died, standing in silence on the very spot where blood had soaked the earth. Some said the wood of the execution platform was reused for gallows in later years, that every man who swung from it died faster, as if the boards remembered what had happened and wanted no more of it. In London, too, strange tales began to attach themselves to Wallace's demise. One butcher, interviewed years later by a Flemish chronicler, claimed that on the night of the execution, the dogs refused to enter the square. Another tale speaks of a raven circling overhead for hours after Wallace's death, never landing, never calling, just watching. These were stories, of course. But they mattered. Because they gave form to what England had tried to erase. Back in Scotland, the Wallace of flesh gave way to the Wallace of prophecy. The tale began to shift. He became not just a freedom fighter, but a martyr. His dismemberment was recast as a form of sainthood, every limb planted in enemy soil like a seed of rebellion. Monks recorded that his head was never truly dead, that it whispered in the wind to those who listened. One outlaw in the Highlands swore Wallace's voice spoke to him in a dream, instructing him to strike a specific English caravan. The caravan was ambushed 2 days later. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the legend swelled. Some medieval scribes, influenced by local folklore, began to write of Wallace with language usually reserved for saints and warriors. He was called Scotland's Lion, the severed general, the one with no grave. He was given omens, dreams, even miracles. One 14th-century manuscript claims that the ground where Wallace was gutted grew thistle overnight, bloody red thistle that no animal would eat. But perhaps the most ironic echo of all was the way England's own methods became their undoing. By quartering him, by sending his limbs to 4 separate cities, they made him omnipresent. There was no single place to mourn him, true, but there were 4 reminders, for spectral limbs raised above the gates of towns that despised the English yoke. For twisted relics rotting in the wind, pointing back at the crown that had put them there. One leg reportedly remained above Berwick for 2 years before it had to be replaced with a straw-stuffed replica to maintain the warning. By then, Wallace's execution had already inspired others. Robert the Bruce, who had once sided with the English, began to move differently. Slowly. Cautiously. But his path toward kingship can be traced through the long shadow cast by Wallace's scaffold. In 1306, Bruce crowned himself King of Scots, less than a year after Edward I's death, and just 5 years after Wallace's execution. Edward, the man who ordered Wallace's dismemberment, died of dysentery while marching north, still obsessed with subduing Scotland. Some chroniclers say he was carried on a litter for days, too weak to sit a horse, defecating blood in secret while issuing commands. His body rotted before he reached the border. The Scots would say Wallace was already avenged. Whether that's true or not, history remembers the moment with eerie symmetry. The man who had Wallace torn apart died in pain, unburied, and far from home. A fringe detail worth noting, some apothecaries of the time believed that the kind of intestinal rot Edward suffered was divine punishment. The logic? Kings were meant to be whole. When a king rotted from the inside out, it was a sign that he had tampered with something holy. Like a martyr's body. Even in medicine, Wallace left a wound. Today, historians still debate whether Wallace truly led Scotland's rebellion or simply became its face. Some suggest his victories were overstated, that his legend outgrew his strategy. Others argue he was the movement's moral core, its incorruptible spirit in a time of shifting loyalties. But none dispute this: his death changed something. It stripped the war of ambiguity. By killing Wallace so publicly, so horrifically, Edward turned a political conflict into a spiritual one. The Scots were no longer just rebels. They were followers of a man who had suffered a holy martyrdom by fire and rope and knife. Every schoolboy in the Highlands would one day hear the story. Not just the victories, but the ending. Especially the ending. They'd hear of the platform, the fire, the entrails, the silent crowd. They'd imagine the rope jerking his body upward, the glint of the knife, the steam rising from his open belly. They'd imagine the smell. Because memory is built from sensation. Not records. Not scrolls. But sights. Sounds. And, most of all, smells. And though no one could bury Wallace, everyone buried a piece of the day he died. In England, it was buried with shame. In Scotland, with rage. And in both, the grave was shallow. Even centuries later, the echoes remain. In 1305, William Wallace was reduced to fragments. In 2025, he is a monument, stone, bronze, and fire. From the battlefield of Stirling to the brooding spire of the Wallace Monument overlooking the River Forth, the man who died in pieces lives on in every commemorative shadow. But what endures more deeply, more intimately, is not his victories, nor his statue. It's the horror of how he died. It's the lesson encoded in brutality. That lesson wasn't lost on those who came after him. During the Jacobite uprisings, hundreds of years later, Highland leaders often invoked Wallace, not for his battlefield genius, but for the manner of his death. Fight like Wallace, they said. Or die like Wallace. The English, ironically, had given Scotland its most enduring martyr. And yet, what happened to Wallace wasn't entirely unique. Other men, too, were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Others were burned, gutted, dismembered, and scattered. But Wallace's death came at the exact crossroads of symbolism and savagery. A foreign king executed a native hero in the heart of his own capital, then scattered the pieces like cursed relics. It's no wonder the myth took root so deeply. In modern forensic terms, Wallace's execution would today be considered a staged degradation event, an intentional, public-facing spectacle designed to maximize psychological trauma. Not just for the victim, but for the witnesses. The goal wasn't simply to punish. It was to control. To redefine the body as a message. Historians have long puzzled over a single discrepancy in the execution records. Some accounts claim Wallace never cried out during the ordeal. Not during the hanging. Not even during the gutting. Others insist he screamed like a wild animal, echoing off the walls of Smithfield. Which is true? It's impossible to know. But the possibility that he said nothing, that he died in silence, terrified the English more than any roar could have. Because silence in agony is power. Silence is defiance. One theory, whispered among nationalist circles centuries later, suggests that Wallace bit through his own tongue before the execution began. That he chose silence. That he refused to give Edward the dignity of a single cry. There's no evidence for this, no physical proof, but the fact that such an image persists tells us something deeper than truth. It tells us what people need to believe. And belief is harder to kill than flesh. The four limbs eventually rotted away, removed by weather, birds, or bureaucracy. The head crumbled. The stories blurred. The execution platform was dismantled, its beams possibly reused in local taverns or scaffolds. In time, the square filled with new bodies, new crimes, new torments. But one thing never returned to Smithfield: peace. The place always felt cursed after that. Even in the 1600s, Protestant pamphleteers warned of demonic presences in the square, blaming it on the martyred Scotsman. Victorian-era gas workers claimed the earth smelled sweeter when they dug there, like old iron and burnt spices. And during World War II, a Luftwaffe bomb fell on Smithfield but failed to detonate. The crater it left revealed ancient timbers blackened with ash and streaked with what appeared to be centuries-old bloodstains. The war effort quickly built over it. But the stain stayed in memory. Across the sea, Scotland never forgot. Each generation retold Wallace's story, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with exaggeration, but always with weight. The man with no grave became the foundation for a nation's identity. In schools, his name was whispered with awe. In pubs, his pain was toasted with bitterness. And on the moors, his spirit was said to ride at night, especially near Stirling, where the air sometimes carries the scent of burning rope. Scholars debate whether Wallace's martyrdom made him a symbol of resistance or a scapegoat for defeat. Whether his execution unified Scotland or simply stalled it. But perhaps the real effect of Wallace's death was to leave a permanent scar on English conscience and Scottish memory alike. He is not a saint. He is not a king. He is something far more dangerous. A wound that never healed. A ghost without peace. A scream that never ends. Wind down, 300 words. And so we return to silence. The smoke has faded. The iron chains lie cold. The scaffold is gone, its blood long since soaked into the soil and forgotten by most. London hums with traffic now, and Smithfield is little more than a market square, filled with the footsteps of commuters, the bark of vendors, the click of heels on cobbled stone. Few know what happened there. Fewer still stop to look down. But the past remains, just beneath the paving stones. It lingers in the hush that falls on certain mornings, in the strange quiet between church bells, and the way crows sometimes circle above the rooftops and never land. Something in the air waits, unsettled. Something remembered. And in Scotland, the wind still moves through the hills with purpose. Children still whisper Wallace's name in shadowed corners. Tourists still touch the stone of his monument and shiver, though they do not know why. The man is gone. The body, burned. The bones, scattered. But in every act of resistance, and every quiet refusal to kneel, there is something of him. Not the sword. Not the legend. Not even the blood. Just the silence. That terrible, unbroken silence. The kind you hear right before the crowd gasps. Right before the blade drops. Right before a king begins to fear the man he tried to erase. This was the fate of William Wallace. And though they tore him apart, they could not keep him dead.